Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this academic ceremony in which Dr. Maarten Vink will officially accept his chair in political science with a focus on political sociology. He will do so by presenting his inaugural lecture entitled Elusive Citizenship. It's above my head. My name is Rijn de Wilde. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, the faculty in which Maarten is appointed. Much to their regret, the chairman of our executive board and Director Magnificus are unable to chair this academic ceremony today due to other obligations. So you have to do it with me today, and I will act as pro-rector. Maarten obtained his PhD in political science in Leiden 12 years ago and has been in Maastricht since 2004. He's a co-director of the Maastricht Center of Citizenship, Migration and Development. We all know that as Maximite, and the Director of Studies of one of our research masters in European Studies. Maarten is also part-time professor at the Ruma Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. And he's also a joint committee coordinator in the framework of IMISCU, Europe's largest network of scholars in the area of migration and integration. And I could go on, listing Maarten's extra activities, nevenwerkzaamheden, as we call it in Dutch. I think Maarten's list is one of the longest in the faculty. So now let's not go into all that. Let's move on, I would say, because I think we all are curious to have you lecture, your inaugural lecture, so to say. So Maarten, the floor is yours.
Meneer de Rector, ladies and gentlemen, today I would like to talk to you about the elusive nature of citizenship. And the argument which I will develop in my lecture is that citizenship eludes individuals, voters, and policymakers. With elusive, you might have wondered, I mean to say citizenship brings high but often unrealistic expectations. First, from individuals who are citizens or aspire to be one. Second, from voters who influence the direction of public policies and thus the rules about the acquisition and loss of citizenship. And third, from policymakers who use citizenship to respond to societal problems such as immigrant integration or international terrorism. And these high expectations are understandable to some extent because citizenship is in fact the most fundamental political status and implies, to speak with Hannah Arendt, the right to have rights. Yet, we should be careful not to attach too high expectations to citizenship. It is not well equipped to tackle the diversity of challenges related to the organization of the good life within political communities. Citizenship, for example, does not prevent racial discrimination. At the same time, making citizenship conditional upon high integration requirements, such as passing a language test or a civic integration test, or asking very high fees for it, does not guarantee that integration problems will be solved. Making citizenship conditional upon stricter requirements merely makes it a more selective status, and as a result, contemporary citizenship laws are frequently subject to amendments, though often without clear or even realistic expectations about what these policy changes can achieve. In this lecture today, I will discuss how states regulate the acquisition and loss of citizenship, why they do so differently, and what the consequences of doing so are. Now let me illustrate the elusive nature of citizenship with two examples. One of a beauty pageant and another one of a famous actor. Ariana Miyamoto, pictured here, is a Japanese beauty pageant who was born to a Japanese mother and an African-American father. She was crowned Miss Japan 2015, but her victory faced criticism from people who verbally abused her for being hafu. This term is used in Japanese to refer to somebody who is biracial. In other words, somebody who is ethnically only half Japanese. Hence, whereas Miyamoto holds Japanese citizenship and speaks fluent Japanese, some people do not think she is Japanese enough to represent Japan in the Miss Universe elections this year. Second, there is the case of Russell Crowe. the well-known actor for movies such as Beautiful Mind and Gladiator, you might know him. And Crowe was born in New Zealand, and according to his Wikipedia entry, his ancestors were English, German, Irish, Maori, Norwegian, Scottish, Swedish, Welsh, Italian, and possibly an Australian convict. Well, while he's a Kiwi, a citizen of New Zealand, when Crowe was 4 years old, his family moved to Sydney, Australia. He moved back to Auckland, New Zealand when he was 14 and back again to Australia when he was 21 and started his acting career. Recently, it was reported that Crowe applied for Australian citizenship in 2006 and again in 2013, but was rejected because he failed to fulfill the residency requirements. Due to shooting major motion pictures abroad, he would have been away from Australia often and apparently does not fulfill the residency requirements for naturalization in Australia. In his own words, I've been voted one of Australia's 50 national treasures. I've even had my face on an Australian stamp, the only non-Australian to do so, apart from the Queen, of course. It's so unreasonable. The cases of Ariana Miyamoto and Russell Crowe, in my view, provide two contrasting illustrations of what I would term elusive citizenship. Miyamoto is formally a citizen of Japan, but still faces unequal treatment in practice. Russell Crowe is considered an Australian by many, even had his face on an Australian stamp, but formally isn't a citizen of Australia. In other words, citizenship is elusive in the sense that even if you have it, you may not be considered a full citizen, whereas even if you don't have it, you may be treated as equal. In this lecture, my interest is especially in the politics of citizenship. Now, over the past decades, one can observe a continuous trend of changes in the laws that regulate the acquisition and loss of citizenship, not only in Europe, but across the globe. Let's look, for example, at the Netherlands. This is probably the best example of a country where citizenship law has been continuously in flux. Here, you see an overview of changes in Dutch citizenship law since 1985. The vertical bars indicate the number of grounds for acquisition or loss, the ways in which you can get it or lose it again, of citizenship that were amended in a particular year. The blue bars indicate the major changes. Since 1985, Dutch citizenship law has been revised comprehensively 3 times. In 1985 with a completely new Nationality Act, then in 2003 with a comprehensive revision, and again in 2009. Major and minor legal revisions were introduced in 7 other years. Moreover, one of the most significant amendments to Dutch citizenship policy, the complete toleration of dual citizenship between 1991 and 1996, was not introduced by law, but by an implementing measure that tolerated dual citizenship in practice. On average, over the past decade, Dutch citizenship law has been altered almost every other year. Now, are all these changes really necessary? Isn't there too much politics around citizenship? Of course, there may be good reasons to introduce changes to citizenship law. Think of the need to remove discriminatory provisions that bias citizenship law in the Netherlands in favor of men until recently. The consequences of this unequal treatment of women were still repaired by amendments to the law as recent as 2010. Other amendments have followed from trends in the modernization of family law, for example with regard to same-sex partnerships. Now, what has happened in the Netherlands, but also more widely, is what I would term the instrumentalization of citizenship law. Citizenship is viewed as a means, an instrument, to solve perceived societal problems since the 1990s, especially related to immigrant integration and lately also to national security. However, citizenship is not a panacea, a wonder solution for all our problems. Instrumentalizing citizenship for policy goals that it is not suitable to address is a self-defeating strategy. Using citizenship as an integration tool is destined to lead to selective incorporation at best, and thus to undermine the very objective it aims to achieve. And this is what I would call the paradox of elusive citizenship. The more we expect from citizenship, the more hopes we put into it, the less it brings us, the more out of reach it gets. Now, what is citizenship actually? And what does it get you? Citizenship, or nationality, as it is often termed in international law, in the first place is a legal status that indicates the relation between an individual and a state. Hence, it is an instrument of classification. It is a status that divides persons into 2 groups, citizens and foreigners. In this sense, citizenship is in itself an empty categorizing concept, speaking with my colleague René de Groot, which only acquires substance within a specific political context. Having citizenship entails legal rights, such as the right to enter your country, to live and work there without restriction, to vote, to hold political office, among others, as well as duties, such as the obligation to serve in the military. Now, some of you may think of citizenship as a passport. However, keep in mind that a passport is primarily a travel document and in itself does not grant any of the rights attached to citizenship. First of all, your passport may have expired, but luckily, this does not mean that your citizenship has. Second, passports are sometimes handed out to persons who actually are not citizens of a state. For example, after the First World War, the so-called Nansen passports, which are pictured here, were issued to refugees from the Russian Civil War who had become stateless after Lenin had revoked citizenship for Russian expatriates in 1921. A third reason for why having a passport should not be equal to having citizenship is that some countries differentiate between various types of citizenship statuses. For example, in Latvia, around 260,000 residents, largely Russophones, who arrived in Latvia during the Soviet era between 1940 and 1991, hold the status of non-citizen. Now, these non-citizens, according to Latvian law, are not stateless because they hold the right to reside in Latvia, and they are also issued with Latvian passports. However, compared with Latvian citizens, their rights are curtailed. They cannot vote and they cannot hold certain positions in government. These non-citizens are not stateless, but they are not full citizens either. Now, what are the rights and duties attached to citizenship vary strongly per country. For example, in many countries there are restrictions on the exercise of voting rights for citizens residing abroad. Hence, if you are a Dutch citizen who resides in Portugal, for example, you are allowed to vote in the Tweede Kamer elections, the national parliament in the Netherlands. But if you are a citizen of Denmark, you only have the right to vote in national elections if you actually reside in Denmark. Remarkably, even for the elections of the European Parliament, for which all EU citizens have the right to vote, if you are residing outside your own country, it matters which EU member state you are a citizen of. If you are Dutch, you are fine. But if you reside in Portugal, if you reside in Portugal, you can vote for either Dutch or the Portuguese representatives to the European Parliament. Not for both, of course. But if you are Danish and living in Portugal, your rights are restricted. You can only vote for Portuguese representatives. Whereas European citizens have the same rights, in practice your rights will differ based on which member state you are a citizen of. These are only two examples of how the substance of citizenship, that is, the rights attached to it, differs between jurisdictions. All men are created equal, to quote the US Declaration of Independence, but no citizenship is the same. Now, not only the substance of citizenship varies, but also the rules on how to get it, and how to lose it again, as a matter of fact. This variation makes citizenship highly elusive. A person who would be considered a citizen in one state, under similar circumstances, may not be a citizen in another state. Now, whereas most persons are a citizen of one state only, many are citizens of multiple states, and more problematic, some are a citizen of none. These two traditionally undesirable phenomena, dual citizenship and statelessness, are largely unavoidable anomalies to the international system. This has to do with the premise of national autonomy in determining the rules that govern the acquisition and loss of citizenship, which makes it difficult or even impossible to coordinate rules between states. And as a result, some persons benefit from over-inclusive rules, or on the other hand, others suffer from under-inclusive rules. Now, as the episode of Russell Crowe illustrates, it's mainly international migration that complicates the regulation of citizenship. Crowe has been denied Australian citizenship on the basis of what he sees as unreasonable grounds, but what are reasonable grounds for the acquisition of citizenship, of course, is open to debate. Traditionally, states have two options to deal with the consequences of migration. They can privilege territorial inclusion and attribute citizenship at birth via jus soli, the law of the soil, to all persons born at the territory of a state, or they can privilege ethnocultural inclusion and attribute citizenship at birth via jus sanguinis, the law of the blood, to descendants of citizens. these different principles are sometimes seen as representing civic or ethnic approaches to citizenship. However, in a paper from 2013 co-authored with Rainer Baubock, we demonstrate that it would be misleading to conceptualize the variation in citizenship laws along a single civic versus ethnic dimension. In our paper, we analyzed the citizenship laws of 36 European states on the basis of data collected by the Judo Citizenship Observatory. In this graph, which is pictured here, we mapped the results of our statistical analysis of how these 36 countries, on the basis of 12 symbolically important functional components of citizenship laws, differ. While an important territorial dimension characterizes citizenship regimes on the basis of provisions on territorial birthright and ordinary naturalization, see the horizontal axis, we show that legal variation cannot be reduced to that single dimension. For a comprehensive analysis of citizenship regimes, indicators of ethnocultural inclusion, the vertical dimension, such as jus sanguinis and cultural affinity, criteria for naturalization should also be taken into account. Hence, the citizenship regime of Bulgaria, which is here in the upper left quadrant, is characterized by strong ethnocultural yet weak territorial inclusion. Belgium, in the bottom right, is characterized by strong territorial inclusion yet relatively weak ethnocultural inclusion. Now, our analysis also highlights that a limited number of states are characterized by expansive regimes that are inclusive on both dimensions, such as Ireland or Portugal, or by contrast, insular regimes that are exclusive on both dimensions, such as Austria or Denmark. In other words, citizenship laws configure along two dimensions which are driven by different conceptions of inclusiveness, but the two principles are not mutually exclusive. We demonstrate that these different principles of inclusion lead to variation not only in the rules on the acquisition of citizenship, how to get it, but also on those on the loss of citizenship. For example, in the Netherlands, citizenship is relatively accessible for immigrants, but it is also relatively easy to lose your Dutch citizenship. In 2009, for example, 5 Dutch speed skaters planned to acquire Kazakh citizenship in order to participate in the Vancouver Olympics. Because the Netherlands already has so many good speed skaters, as you all know, I'm sure, the competition for Olympic tickets is very strong. Hence, they were invited by the Kazakh Olympic Federation to represent Kazakhstan in Vancouver. And they thought this might be a good idea. However, as the 5 speed skaters discovered, if you voluntarily acquire another citizenship, you automatically lose your Dutch citizenship and the rights attached to it. Even though at least one of them had already become Kazakh national champion at the 5-kilometer distance in 2009, at the last moment they all cancelled their planned naturalization in Kazakhstan after they were warned about the consequences. Hence, the 5K Kazakh champion from 2009, Jorrit Bergsma, became the 10K Olympic champion for the Netherlands in 2014. Now, citizenship is of course not just elusive for actors and speed skaters. More and more, citizenship is seen as a flexible status that provides security and can facilitate life in a globalized world. Consultancy firms such as Henley & Partners advise global clients about how to obtain a second or third passport. And best known are the investor citizenship programs that exist in the Caribbean island nations, for example, of St. Kitts and Nevis, where citizenship can be acquired for as little as $250,000. In the EU, Cyprus and Malta offer fast-track pathways to citizenship to foreign investors, though these require significantly higher investments up to several millions. Now, this flexibility increases the elusiveness of citizenship. It may be more accessible. At some places you can simply buy it, but what does it really mean if citizenship is indeed for sale? As a result of migration, gender equality, and more flexible attitudes to dual citizenship, increasingly more people find themselves in a de facto complex citizenship situation. For example, in the Netherlands, immigrants acquiring Dutch citizenship need to renounce their previous citizenship unless they qualify for one of the exceptions. Yet, there are currently around 1.2 million Dutch citizens residing in the Netherlands with dual citizenship. That's around 7% of the population. And as you see in the slide, this number has doubled since 1998. after the requirement to renounce one's previous citizenship had in fact been reintroduced. This is because children from parents with different citizenships often automatically acquire dual citizenship. Hence, restrictive naturalization rules cannot stop dual citizenship. More flexible entry into citizenship is also reflected in greater flexibility with regard to the loss of citizenship. Increasingly more states face pressures from expatriates, immigrants, who wish to naturalize in the country where they live. This leads to a trend of more tolerant policies. Based on a novel data set of expatriate dual citizenship policies since 1960 in over 200 states, collected with René de Groot and Choon Look within the Maastricht Center for Citizenship, Migration and Development, Maximite, we find that dual citizenship toleration has increased dramatically over the last half century. The graph on this slide shows a strong and nearly linear trend towards the acceptance of expat dual citizenship. The bold line in the middle represents the global trend. While only around a third of all countries that existed in 1960 accepted dual citizenship, this percentage increases steadily to almost 2/3 of countries in 2013. This trend took place in all regions around the world, though more forcefully in the Americas and less strong in Asia and Africa. In Europe, the change from restrictive to tolerant policies precisely follows the global trend, but the Netherlands is an exception to this trend. In a recent paper co-authored with de Groot and Loek together with Arjen Schakel and David Reigel, we use these data to analyze why traditionally restrictive dual citizenship policies survive in some countries, but not in others. We find, first of all, that states that existed since 1960 have a greater than 50% chance to move from restrictive to tolerant dual citizenship policies. Second, we find that the propensity to move to a tolerant regime does not depend on the size of the country, economic strength, or experience of political violence. Third, we observe that what matters most is the dual citizenship policy of neighboring countries. If no neighboring country accepts expatriate dual citizenship, then restrictive policies have a 65% chance to survive after 50 years. However, if all neighboring countries accept dual citizenship, the chance for restrictive policies to survive goes down to 20%. We call this a diffusion effect, comparable to similar studies in the democratization literature, for example, where tolerant policies in states put pressures on those policies in neighboring states. Dual citizenship is diffused from one country to the other. And we distinguish two underlying mechanisms for that. First, while fears of dual citizenship continue to exist, they weaken as more countries tolerate expatriates' dual citizenship. This is a learning mechanism. Countries learn that there is not so much to fear from dual citizenship. Second, immigrant communities are also aware of the experiences of other groups in migration destination countries, and they put pressure on the governments of their origin countries. This is an emulation mechanism. The international norm of dual citizenship is copied from one state to the other. Fourth, when we look more closely at these processes, we expect that policy diffusion resonates especially within democratic regimes. After all, for electoral reasons, in democracies, governments are more sensitive to the demands of expatriate communities and international norms. For non-democracies, we find that there is no significant effect of policies of neighboring countries. Rather, in those countries, it is the size of received remittances that matters. In other words, for autocratic states, it's money that matters. For democracies, however, the diffusion effect is significant and strong. Here, norms matter more than money. As a result, legislative attempts to countenance dual citizenship, as in the Netherlands, seem increasingly arbitrary and arguably futile. Our data shows that the trend is unidirectional and that reverting back to restrictive policies rarely occurs. The pressure from expat communities was evident in the successful lobby of the Dutch immigrant community against the proposal of the previous government to restrict dual citizenship for immigrants in the Netherlands. Increasing expatriate dual citizenship toleration is largely a self-sustaining phenomenon. Now, if dual citizenship is tolerated for expats, then why not for immigrants? This is a good question, and let us now discuss the politics of citizenship a bit further. After all, if citizenship wasn't a highly politicized issue, we would not see such a high degree of volatility in the regulation of it. The Dutch case again provides a good example. Together with Hans Smeets and Statistics Netherlands, I have investigated attitudes to dual citizenship in the Netherlands as part of the Dutch election survey in 2010 and 2012. We asked respondents whether they thought that immigrants who naturalized in the Netherlands should be required to renounce their previous citizenship. And as you see in the slide, look at the blue bars. In 2012, 49% of respondents agreed with this renunciation requirement. This means that they are against dual citizenship for immigrants. 31% disagreed and 20% neither agreed nor disagreed. And these percentages are largely comparable in 2010. When looking at political preferences of voters, unsurprisingly, we find that most respondents, almost 80%, but not all, who indicated that they voted for the PVV, the Freedom Party, hold a negative view on immigrant dual citizenship. Among center-right voters, a bit over 50% of voters is against immigrant dual citizenship. And in further analysis, we demonstrate that a negative attitude to dual citizenship is linked to perceiving immigration as a cultural threat, to negative views on the admission of asylum seekers, and to the need for immigrants to assimilate culturally. Hence, skepticism about dual citizenship is connected to fears about migration and its consequences. Now pay attention to this. In 2012, we also asked respondents for their views on emigrant dual citizenship. Should Dutch citizens, such as the speed skaters I just discussed, who acquire another citizenship, be allowed to maintain their Dutch citizenship? As you see in the slide, now look at the red bars, we find that the negative attitudes towards dual citizenship for immigrants are not mirrored when asked for dual citizenship among immigrants. 45% of the respondents agrees that Dutch citizens naturalizing abroad should be allowed to retain their Dutch citizenship, whereas only 30% disagrees with that statement. The largest discrepancy can be found among Christian Democratic voters, whereas a majority of these voters is against immigrant dual citizenship, a majority is in favor of emigrant dual citizenship. We also find that our explanatory model for attitudes to dual citizenship, perceiving immigration as a cultural threat, does not work as well for attitudes to emigrant dual citizenship as it does for attitudes to immigrant dual citizenship. In other words, citizenship, especially dual citizenship, also seems to elude voters. These ambiguous views are problematic both legally and normatively. Legally, if one were to require naturalizing immigrants to renounce their previous citizenship upon naturalization, but allow Dutch citizens to acquire another, naturalized immigrants would simply reacquire their previous citizenship without penalty. Hence, legally, a mixed approach makes little sense. Normatively, there is no convincing justification for requiring immigrants to renounce their citizenship, but allowing Dutch citizens abroad to naturalize without penalty. Hence, there's much to say for maintaining the current situation where the exceptions to the renunciation requirement for naturalizing immigrants in the Netherlands are mirrored in the exceptions on the loss provisions applying to Dutch citizens naturalizing abroad, or in line with the broader European and global trend to accept dual citizenship altogether. But the data show why this is politically difficult in the Netherlands. Voters remain skeptical about dual citizenship, even if we cannot avoid it. Now that we have discussed the politics of citizenship, do citizenship policies actually matter? And if so, for whom? And how do they matter? Let's look at the available statistics about citizenship acquisition in the European Union. First, around 800,000 persons per year acquire the citizenship of an EU member state. These are mostly people who did not get the citizenship of that country when they were born, but acquired this later in life. Second, while a bit under 1 million of naturalizations per year may seem a lot to you, remember that there are around 500 million people currently living in one of the EU's 28 member states. Of these, there are around 20 million foreign residents, that's about 4%. And in this slide, you see that the average naturalization rate in the EU in 2012, which is calculated as the percentage of foreign residents that acquires the citizenship of a state, is a bit over 2%. That's actually not so much. Though this varies greatly between Hungary, with almost 13%, and Slovakia, less than 0.5%. These two percentages, by the way, are also related to each other. Third, looking only at a single year, obscures the trends in these acquisition rates, which vary greatly over time. In the Netherlands, around 4% of all resident foreigners acquired Dutch citizenship in 2012. That's higher than the EU average. That's around 30,000 people per year. Now, this may seem like a high number to you, but keep in mind that in 1996 there were still 80,000 foreigners who acquired Dutch citizenship, and since then this number has steadily decreased. The graph visualizes this trend. Now, for anyone with a bit of knowledge about Dutch citizenship law, it will be self-evident that this trend relates closely to changing requirements for naturalization. First, the strong increase in the number of naturalizations in the 1990s, in the middle of the graph, can be directly related to the abolishment of the requirement to renounce one's previous citizenship, temporarily between 91 and 96. Second, the low number of naturalizations since 2003 can be directly related to the introduction of the naturalization exam in 2003 and, in fact, the increased fees over the past decade. However, deriving effects of policies on naturalization rates is not so straightforward. You cannot just read it from a graph like this. Aggregate statistics on citizenship as provided by Eurostat or the national statistical offices provide a useful overview of the main trends, but they are not easily comparable between countries. Naturalization rates, after all, vary not only because of citizenship policies, but also because of factors related to the country of origin and the individual life situation of the immigrants who live in a country. For example, as you see in the slide above me, immigrants from more developed countries, from countries with a higher Human Development Index, or HDI, which is pictured on the horizontal axis, have a much lower probability to naturalize than those from least developed countries. This graph is based on an analysis of data from 15 European countries in a paper I did with Diana Prokic and Jaap Dronkers. Whereas most immigrants from the least developed countries tend to naturalize, as you see in the upper left corner of the graph, only 20% of those from the most developed countries naturalize. And from other research, we know that also the political stability and the dual citizenship regulations of an origin country matter. In other words, when analyzing immigrant naturalization rates, it is important to have information on the demographic composition of the immigrant population of a country. In the 2013 paper with Prokic and Dronkers, we control statistically for these differences in the demographic composition of migrant populations and for the relative accessibility of citizenship. For that, we used an indicator produced by the Migrant Integration Policy Index, or MIPEX. The 2015 version of MIPEX is just being launched this month. We found that indeed citizenship policies do matter. However, they matter most for the migrants who are most in need of it, namely those from the least developed countries. On average, whereas only 20% of immigrants in the most restrictive countries naturalize if they have lived there between 6 to 10 years, almost 60% of immigrants naturalize in those countries with the most accessible laws. That's quite a big difference. For immigrants from highly developed countries, however, policies do not matter. Their naturalization rates are much lower anyway, and citizenship acquisition is mostly a function of the length of residence in the destination country. Now, of course, as we already saw in the Netherlands, countries do not have stable, accessible, or restrictive policies. Policies change, and sometimes opening up citizenship, as Portugal did in 2006, sometimes restricting it, as the Netherlands did in 2003. In the literature, there is surprisingly little interest in the effects of these policy changes, even though this is the question with the greatest policy relevance. Often it is simply assumed that policy restrictions will lower naturalization rates, but actually we know little about the question for whom these restrictions matter most and how much. In research I currently do with Floris Peters and Hans Smeets, supported by Maximite, we analyze population register data from Statistics Netherlands over the period since 1998. In this analysis, we look at foreign-born residents in the Netherlands and include statistical controls for origin country and individual characteristics of immigrants. We find that the restriction of Dutch citizenship law in April 2003 had a significantly negative impact on immigrant naturalization rates, as we expected. Among immigrants who arrived in the Netherlands in 1995, 96, or 97, who could still naturalize before 2003, on average, 45% was naturalized after around 6 years. Yet among cohorts from 2000, 2001, and 2002, who could only naturalize after 2003, only 30%, so that's 45 versus 30%, was naturalized after a similar period. Even after 10 years of residence in the Netherlands, there is still a significant difference in naturalization rates of 55% versus 40%. These differences are even greater if you look at those groups who are most in need of citizenship, again, such as immigrants from less developed countries. In the graph, which you see here, you see the so-called survival curves, which represent the probability that immigrants, that the foreign status of immigrants does not survive, that they do not naturalize. In other words, the chance that the status of foreigner survives. We compare immigrants from cohorts that could still naturalize under the pre-2003 legislation on the left, and those who could do so only under the stricter 2003 law on the right. As you see, the blue line is for immigrants from highly developed countries, is virtually the same between cohorts that fall under the pre- and the post-2003 legislation. However, for immigrants from less developed countries, the red lines, the difference is significant. The red line on the left decreases much more steeply than the red line on the right. This means that immigrants from cohorts that fall under the stricter 2003 legislation naturalize later and less often. In other words, we see that policy does matter, especially for those immigrants who are most interested in naturalizing. And it is not just that under the 2003 law these immigrants postpone naturalization, they seem to be put off altogether. And if you argue that this was precisely what was intended by the legislator, I would disagree. In fact, the 2003 changes in the Netherlands, including the naturalization exam, were motivated by a political agenda of failed integration policies. Hence, the changes were aimed at improving immigrant integration. Yet the result of these changes, as the analysis shows, was only a more selective access to citizenship. The Dutch case shows how the instrumentalization of citizenship policies makes citizenship not less, but more elusive for large groups of immigrants. Now, one last issue I'd like to discuss with you is whether it matters how fast immigrants naturalize. This question is relevant in light of the proposal by the current government in the Netherlands to increase the residence requirement for ordinary naturalization from 5 to 7 years. The assumption is that immigrants who naturalize later will be better integrated at the moment of naturalization. They have been living longer in the Netherlands. Hence, naturalizing later is better. But is that really so? Bevelander and de Voorwich have recently argued that a fast track to citizenship can maximize the potential for settlement success, although too short a waiting period before naturalization can diminish its potential. Their reasoning is that citizenship acquisition by immigrants can have a premium on the labor market. There is a lot of research on that. Does naturalization pay off in better employability of immigrants, a higher income? Because it sends a positive signal to employers about the long-term settlement of immigrants in the country. After a very short period, for example 2 or 3 years, they argue that the accumulated country-specific human capital, such as education, knowledge of the labor market, or language, is still minimal. Hence, with a very short residence requirement, the citizenship ascension rates, the naturalization rates, are high, as you see in the green line, and many immigrants may naturalize, but the labor market payoff of doing so will be minimal, as you see in the red line. This is an economic model, of course. However, if the waiting period for citizenship becomes too long, on the other hand, the citizenship premium inevitably declines. Naturalized immigrants have fewer years to profit from a positive signal vis-à-vis employers if they naturalize after a very long waiting time. Hence, there will be less incentives for immigrants to accumulate the necessary human capital while waiting for citizenship. Naturalizing after 10 or 15 or 20 years simply doesn't pay off as much as it does if you naturalize earlier, after 5 years. Now, with Prokic and Dronkers, I did some preliminary analysis on the question of whether the speed of naturalization matters. We used data from the European Labour Force Survey from 2008 and analyzed the relation between the speed of naturalization and the probability of having paid employment among immigrants. We control for individual and country of origin characteristics. While the picture is mixed of our analysis, we find that in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, there is indeed a negative correlation between years of residence until naturalization, the speed of naturalization on the one hand, and the probability of having paid employment on the other hand. This suggests that immigrants who naturalize later perform less well on the labor market. Hence, we do not find support for the argument that it is better for immigrants to naturalize after a longer residence period, at least not in the Netherlands. If anything, the data suggests the opposite. The faster an immigrant naturalizes, the higher the citizenship premium on the labor market. Now, from this perspective, there are good reasons to caution against the government proposal that is currently under discussion in the Netherlands. As Bevelander and de Voorweg argue, a longer pathway essentially leads to lower naturalization rates, and it reduces the possibility for immigrants to make use of the positive potential of citizenship. However, we should be careful when interpreting these preliminary findings. First, in 3 other countries, we found no relation, and in one country, the UK, we found the opposite relation. Hence, as is often the case in this type of research, results vary by country. This may be explained, for example, by the structure of the labor market between the UK and continental Europe, or by variation in citizenship policies. For this reason, more comparative research is needed to investigate the relationship between speed of naturalization and immigrant integration under various institutional conditions. Second, in order to analyze whether naturalization makes a difference, one needs to draw on longitudinal data, rather than on cross-sectional survey data that we use in the exploratory analysis I just mentioned. Longitudinal data, where you can follow people over time, for example, those we employ in the Maximite research project with Floris Peters and Hans Smeets, based on Dutch register data, allow us to detect whether citizenship acquisition actually improves labor market outcomes, or whether, by contrast, better integrated immigrants are simply more likely to naturalize. These results we hope to share within the next couple of months. Moreover, further comparative research is required to compare such findings from the Netherlands with those from other countries, based on similar type of high-quality register data. This is something I plan to work on in the coming years, especially with colleagues from Scandinavian countries where similar type of register data are available as in the Netherlands. So there's more work still to do in this field. Now let me sum up my main argument. First, citizenship is an elusive concept. It is both everything and nothing. By defining its permanent population, citizenship is an important constituent element of the modern nation state. Yet, its meaning depends on the context in which it is practiced. States attach different rights to citizenship, and each state employs different rules for the acquisition and loss of citizenship. Hence, citizenship is an important status that can, however, mean different things. Second, citizenship eludes policymakers and voters. States have autonomy to regulate the access to citizenship, yet in an interconnected world, policies in one country do affect outcomes in other countries. Moreover, phenomena that were previously considered undesirable, such as dual citizenship, become increasingly unavoidable. Hence, we see the acceptance of dual citizenship gradually spreading across the world. Policymakers in states with restrictive policies, such as the Netherlands, are increasingly under pressure from immigrant communities to loosen these rules. At the same time, domestic electorates provide a counterbalance, pushing for restrictive policies, as in the Netherlands, where attitudes towards citizenship are ambiguous, with dual citizenship tolerated for one group but not for others. For one group immigrants but not for others immigrants. Third, citizenship also eludes individuals. Varying naturalization rates demonstrate that citizenship has different meanings to different people. Some immigrants may be able to naturalize, but they are not interested in doing so. For others, however, acquiring the citizenship of a developed country provides a potentially life-changing event. Yet, restrictive rules and high costs do discourage people from naturalizing, and they are most discouraging for those who need citizenship most. Citizenship is elusive, and its instrumentalization for political agendas makes it even more so. To conclude, I'd like to say a few words about the chair of political science with a focus on political sociology, which I accept today with this public lecture, and my research agenda for the coming years. As one of my 2 PhD supervisors at Leiden University, Herman van Gunsteren, already observed back in 1978, citizenship as a concept is essentially contested. Its meaning depends on ideological viewpoint and on the context in which it is practiced. Hence, citizenship is elusive by its nature and requires versatility from us as analysts in 2 important ways. While interdisciplinarity is required to capture the multiple dimensions of the concept of citizenship, a comparative approach is essential to capture its contingency. Now, this is easier said than done. If there's one thing I've come to realize over the past years, through research but also teaching experience, it is that interdisciplinarity does not come cheap. For the citizenship research agenda I outlined today, analyzing the causes and consequences of citizenship policies, this means that you need to be a lawyer, a political scientist, a sociologist, and an economist at the same time. After all, we need to collect and interpret information about national laws in light of international standards, but how these laws come about is a different matter. That's where political science comes in, and how these policies affect naturalization rates and labor market outcomes among immigrants, that's where we need sociologists and economists. And finally, I should not forget normative theorists for a reflection on how citizenship should be governed. Now, whereas these different questions can of course be studied separately, a truly interdisciplinary research agenda approaches these questions in an integrated manner. First of all, this is important because without valid data on citizenship, statistical analysis on developments in citizenship policies or even on the effects of policies on naturalization rates would be impossible. Second, an analysis of naturalization rates or integration outcomes also requires a systematic understanding of the institutional context. If there's one thing you can observe in the thriving literature on the question of whether citizenship matters for immigrant integration, it is that the results of these different studies often differ greatly. For some people, this is an argument that citizenship in the end doesn't really matter. But for me, this just means that there is an underlying contextual variation that we do not yet understand well. Hence, sociologists and economists benefit from collaboration with lawyers and political scientists. The subdiscipline of political sociology, which involves the systematic study of the relations between state and society, offers such a bridge between political science and sociology. My own research, as presented today, illustrates what an interdisciplinary political sociology approach can contribute to citizenship studies. I see it as the core responsibility of this chair to further interdisciplinary and comparative research on political sociology themes such as migration and citizenship, but also broader themes within European studies, within the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and at Maastricht University at large. This means building bridges both within my own faculty and between faculties. As I hope to have demonstrated today, such bridges offer a chance to overcome the constraints of narrow disciplinary approaches. A successful political sociology agenda for citizenship, which is based on fundamental research and is policy relevant, needs to be both comparative and interdisciplinary. Citizenship, to conclude, may be elusive to policymakers, voters, and individuals, but for scholars there are ways of dealing with that. Coming to the end of my talk, I'd like to extend a few but important words of gratitude. First of all, I would like to thank Maastricht University for its trust in me with this appointment as Professor of Political Science with a focus on political sociology. This is truly an honor. Within the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, I'm very thankful to Rijn de Wilde and Sophie van Honacker, where's Sophie? For supporting my appointment. With your support, I would not stand here today. My gratitude extends to the whole faculty, where I felt welcome since starting here back in 2004. It is an extremely rewarding place to work. At Maastricht University at large, I would like to thank my colleagues René de Groot, Valentina Mazzucato, Hildegard Snijder, and Melissa Siegel of the Executive Board of the Maastricht Center for Citizenship, Migration and Development, Maximite, as well as Kostika Dumbrova, for their cooperative spirit in setting up and expanding this joint initiative. I have spoken before about the importance of cooperation across academic disciplines, and I believe that our efforts to pool resources from various faculties with the support of the UM's Executive Board have been extremely productive so far. I look forward to working with you within the new ITEM project, establishing the Institute on Transnational and Regional Cross-Border Cooperation. I'd like to devote a special thank you to René de Groot, Professor of Comparative Law and Private International Law at this university, who has been extremely supportive of my work ever since I visited Maastricht from Leiden during my PhD research in the early 2000s to discuss the Micheletti case. I will not talk about that today. And other developments in the area of nationality law, while, I might say, enjoying an excellent lunch, if I remember well, which struck me as a visitor from the Calvinist western part of our country. Meanwhile, we have co-authored several works together, and it is simply a delight to work together. Thanks also to Olivier Vonk for joining some of these co-productions. Two other UM colleagues I'd like to mention. First, Jaap Dronkers, Professor of International Comparative Research on Educational Performance and Social Inequality. Jaap, unfortunately, could not be here today. He is traveling, but his infectious enthusiasm for sociological research has contributed much to the research agenda I presented here today. Then, Hans Smeets, Professor of Social Statistics at my faculty and also at Statistics Netherlands, with whom I have collaborated on some of the projects discussed earlier, and I look forward to continuing working on many new big data initiatives. Beyond Maastricht, I'd like to acknowledge my great appreciation for the presence today of Professor Joe Shaw of Edinburgh University and Professor Rainer Baubach of the European University Institute. Joe and Rainer, it is a true privilege to co-direct the European Union Democracy Observatory on Citizenship with you, and I'm delighted both of you could make it here today. UDO Citizenship by now has firmly established itself as the go-to place for information about developments relating to citizenship. Our observatory keeps on expanding, it has to be said, thematically and geographically, and is a prime example of how much can be established with relatively limited but significant support from European and national funding agencies. Much of the work depends on our large network of country experts in over 70 countries in Europe and since recently also the Americas. Thanks also to the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the EY in Florence for facilitating my work as co-director through a part-time professorship. Finally, aside from academia, thanks to all the friends and family for joining me here today. It's a special day and I'm happy you're all here to listen and in a moment to celebrate. I'm grateful to my parents for their love and support. Dankjewel. And last but not least, to Patricia for showing me that something as elusive as love can still be very tangible. Ik heb gezegd.
Dear Professor Vink, thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. I think indeed, we're living in a world which is increasingly mobile, and also indeed in a world in which policies on citizenship are increasingly a political instrument. And in that kind of world, we need research and comprehensive research, ethnographic research, of course, in these kind of issues, but also statistical research. And I think you showed us that that research can really lead to important insights. And maybe not just us, but also, our politicians, that they move somehow a little bit beyond opinion. So thanks a lot for that. And with this, I close this academic ceremony and invite you all to congratulate the new professor in the rafter. And if you don't know where that is, just follow the red ropes. Thank you.